All right, we're back now. We have our new sneaker on the tire. Right now we're running a Continental Race Attack, so this hopefully will be a great tire. The review will be posted on the site. Before we put the tire back into the motorcycle, we need to put the sprocket back on. Before you can put the sprocket back into the rubber cush components, it helps to use like a little bit of a silicone spray or some sort of lubricant so that the teeth slide into the little spaces in here. Otherwise, the rubber will just kind of grip as you would kind of expect. So just put a light coating. That's all it takes. Depending on how your motorcycle is assembled, a lot of your sprocket carriers will have a little spacer or something on the inside. Some of them come out, some don't. Just make sure that it's still there before you slide it back into the cush drive. And then just kind of press it back in. It should seat, and now we're going to be ready to put it into the motorcycle. Typically, the first step before sliding the wheel back in is you want to get your rotor to line up back with your brake pads. So remember, be gentle, don't force anything, and what we want to do is we just kind of want to work it in. So we're just going to kind of shimmy it around and slide it in so that now the brake caliper is on the rotor. All right, next, before we move again, is we want to just put the chain back on the sprocket. It's going to be greasy, it's going to be nasty, and you may have to kind of shimmy the wheel a little bit to get enough slack in the chain to get it back onto the sprocket. Then we put the spacer back in place. Next, you got to take the spacer on the other side of the wheel. Some motorcycles are going to be easier than others. Some of the new bikes, this all happens a lot nicer. But why we chose the SV is so we can really kind of illustrate it. This is your caliper carrier, and you need to have a spacer between the one and the other. So you kind of hold it in place, and then we slide everything back up. And it should, our key word, it should stay there while we lift the wheel up and slide the axle in, but it won't. So be prepared for the fun. The next step before lifting the wheel and sliding the axle into place is we want to make sure that our axle carriers that set our chain adjustment are in and pushed forward all the way. Finally, the last thing before we start putting it all back together is we take the axle and we want to put a light layer of grease or anti-seize onto the axle to help it slide in, and then when it's time for the next tire change, the axle will slide out so it doesn't get seized in there from road grime and getting dry. We have two methods for this. One is we take an old nasty paintbrush and we put bearing grease on it so we don't have to get our hands all mucky. Or we use anti-seize, which also comes with its own brush. This stuff is really nasty, but also really effective. Since the SV has a problem with the axle getting stuck, we're just going to put a light coat of anti-seize on the axle. Put most of it up at the head of the axle, because as you slide it in, it's going to drive it down over the rest of the axle. All right, now the hard part of this is you have to hold the wheel up, keep all the spacers from falling out, and slide the axle in. Two hands is hard to do this with, especially with the SV. One thing that makes it easier is you take something like a hammer and you put it underneath the tire to kind of help hold it up so you're not having to hold it up and line everything up. But if you have the help of somebody else, we have the lovely Chris, it'll sometimes help keep everything in line. So what we're going to do, we're going to have Chris standing over the other side and hold that funny spacer into place while we lift up the wheel and slide everything in. If all goes well, it should just kind of slip in, but I don't think it will. Lift it up, get it into place, and take the axle, and slide it in. So that's the hard part right there. This is why those pit teams get paid the big bucks. To drive the axle the rest of the way through the wheel is going to require a little bit of tapping. But I caution you not to force it. Don't bang it. It's just little tapping. Again, we're going to go back to our nice little loaded hammer with the sand in it. And we're just going to kind of like line the wheel up as best we can and just do a little tapping until we work it through. Again, don't force it. Just kind of let it work it through. Once the axle's in place and all the way through and your spacers are still there, don't be surprised if it takes you 2 or 3 times to get it right. Take your time. Don't force it. Before we start snugging things up, we want to tap the tire forward and make sure that our little chain adjusters on the back of the swing arm are all the way forward. If they're back at all, or if you skip this step, your tire will end up out of alignment, which will cause unnecessary wear on your chain and sprockets. With the axle all the way in and the tire tapped all the way forward, we start by putting our spacers back in place in the same order that we took them off. You'll notice that the end of your axle has 4 little holes in it. Those holes have to line up with the crowns on the nut so that we can get the cotter pin back in. The most common mistake we see from people who are new to motorcycling working on their own bikes is they tend to over tighten things and they end up stripping bolts and nuts out. The axle is a pretty important part. We don't want it to be too loose, but we can't over tighten it. You can buy a torque wrench for these size of bolts, but they're really expensive. So it's best to kind of learn a feel for how tight you want it. You want it fairly snug, but not so tight that you're putting an undue amount of force. Once you get to where it feels pretty snug, you're starting to feel a fair amount of resistance, you just want to make sure that the crowns on the nut line up with the hole on the axle. Your final and last step is to put the cotter pin in. If your bike is equipped with one of these guys, you can just slide it in and you're good to go. If you don't, then you got to go with the cotter pin. The cotter pin, if you look at it closely, has one arm that is longer than the other. When we put it in, we want to make sure that longer arm is facing to the front as we slide it into place. Once we have it into place, we grab the longer arm with a pair of pliers and we bend it up over the front of the axle. Then we clip off the shorter arm. And that's it. Your wheel is back in place. The hardest part is to line up everything when you slide the axle through. I can't stress enough, don't force it, take your time, and be patient. That's the hardest part about working with motorcycles. Once it's together, it's a good idea to take it for a quick test ride, and then make sure everything is snug and in place. Thanks for watching, and check out our site for more stuff, canyonchasers.net.